with Eastern Sierra, Asia. And yeah, big shout out to the climbing rangers. You guys do such an awesome job, like looking out for the climbing areas and the climbing community on the east side. So yeah, thanks so much. So yeah, so I guess I'll start us off here. I just have like a little slideshow prepared to take you guys on this journey that I went on back in 2017. Let's see, keynote. And then, okay. So yeah, this is just like my intro page. Sorry, little technical difficulties here. Oh no, cancel. Okay, is this working? Can you guys see my screen?
I think it closed out of your screen.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No worries.
I don't know. I should have tested this out. Okay, so I'll try screen sharing again. All right, is that working okay?
Yeah, it looks like it's working. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, and is this bar, is that showing up for you guys or is it not? I have like this bar in the middle of my screen, but I wasn't sure if it was just me. No, okay, great. Sorry, I thought this would be all seamless because, but I haven't been able to switch slides, I guess. Let me see this again. Sorry about that, guys.
No worries.
I'll try that again. So when I started the screen sharing, when I went to Keynote, it wouldn't let me switch slides.
I see. It might be how you're sharing your screen. You might have to
okay.
directly choose that Keynote screen instead of the desktop screen.
I'll try that. Okay. Okay, I think it's working now. All right, sorry. So today I wanted to talk to you all about my trip to Palestine in 2017. And it's a little journey that I'll take you on. So yeah, some of y'all might be asking or have a question of like where or what exactly is Palestine? And I could give you a whole slideshow presentation just on that question, but I'm just going to keep the answer really short and say, you know, I'm sure most people are familiar with the state of Israel. And so the state of Israel was created in 1948, and Palestine was what that land was called before the state of Israel was created. And Palestinians were the ones living there. And so in around 1948, Palestine, which was under British control at the time, got kind of divvied up into a couple of main areas. And that was, one was the Israeli state, and the other section was kind of put aside to become a future Palestinian state. And that area is kind of the blue bit of the map on the two maps to the right, the kind of bigger blue section. And that area I refer to as Palestine and or the West Bank. And that's the area that I traveled to during this trip. And when I'm talking about these stories, it mostly is happening in that area. And today I'll be using the words, you know, Palestine and the West Bank to refer to these areas kind of interchangeably. So just a real quick answer to that, because I don't want to delve into it too much. And others might be asking, you know, why travel from Yosemite, or the Eastern Sierra, to go rock climbing in Palestine. And the other short answer for that is that my mom and her family are from Ramallah, which is kind of the de facto capital of Palestine, or the West Bank. So that's where they're from. And my mom was born over there and spent the first few years of her life there, but then she moved to the US when she was still pretty young. And she grew up, okay, it's not letting me keep going now. Sorry, guys. Okay, so sorry about that. It just, I was able to do the slideshow, but then all of a sudden I was not able to switch slides. So I'll just try this again and hopefully it works.
You might want to try it in that view too, if it doesn't work this time.
The keynote view?
But
yeah, that's what I was trying. Okay, so now I'm able to switch slides. Okay, so yeah, here we have a photo, kind of a poor quality photo, of the 4 generations. Me as a baby, my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother, kind of in the shadows there. It's not the best quality photo. So yeah, my mom grew up, had me, and I'm not sure. Okay. Every time I need to switch screens, it keeps. So I'm going to the keynote. Option when I share screen.
You might want to just keep it in this view.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Is that okay for everyone? Can make it open it up a little bit. So yeah, I grew up kind of typical American kid. I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And, it's like when I went to my dad's family's house, or when I hung out with my dad's family, it was pretty typical American, like everyone was speaking English and watching, football on TV and eating ham and rolls for dinner. But then when I'd hang out with my mom's side of the family, people were mostly speaking Arabic and watching things like Al Jazeera on TV. And, we'd be eating Palestinian foods that I still can't pronounce the names of. So yeah, that was kind of my introduction, or my exposure to Palestine and the culture and the people of Palestine, was through that side of the family. And they would also go on trips. So my grandmother, my cousins, and other family members would often, like pretty much every summer, go on trips to Palestine. And I wasn't ever able to go there as a kid because my parents didn't have enough money to travel like that. So I kind of got this exposure of Palestine through them, where they would talk about their trips back to Ramallah, which at that point in time was just like kind of a smaller town, like kind of more like a village. And they would bring back, gifts and jewelry for me and just tell me all about, their time there. And my other exposure to Palestine was going to protests, because growing up just in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., there was a lot of protests that we could go to, and a lot of the protests that my mom and dad would take me to were things like protests that had to do with Palestine. And so I kind of got a little bit of exposure to that. And of course, we would go to all sorts of protests. And that was kind of my first exposure to the intersectionality of, social justice, or equal rights in Palestine and equal rights here in the United States. So yeah, growing up, for some reason, I was not like the coolest kid. I was kind of an outlier, didn't have a lot of friends, wasn't super popular. I was terrible at sports. So early on, I learned kind of not to mention my Palestinian heritage, because it wouldn't really help me fit in. because, because of our kind of media and what a lot of my friends' kind of idea of what Palestinians were, they kind of all thought of Palestinians as terrorists or martyrs or at best, refugees. So I kind of knew that I should kind of keep that part of me, not really. I never really like brought that up to my friends for any reason. But luckily early on, I started climbing and I fell in love with it like right away. This is actually the first picture of me, or the first time I ever went climbing in a summer camp. And I quickly became obsessed with rock climbing. I started going to the gym like every week. I joined the junior team. I eventually started working at the gym. And then as soon as I graduated college, I moved out west and started working in Yosemite. I got a job washing dishes in Tuolumne Meadows at the lodge there, and just climbed as much as I possibly could. And at that time, I was mostly a sport climber and a boulderer. I hadn't really done much trad climbing, but I quickly learned how to place gear, how to get up multi-pitches, and eventually learned how to climb the bigger walls in the valley. And after a while, they gave me a job at the Yosemite Mountaineering School. Yeah, all I had to do was pass a drug test. So, and then I was able to take all sorts of climbers up some of the awesome multi-pitches, classic moderate climbs in Tuolumne and in the valley. So I was pretty stoked. And yeah, this was all seasonal work. So I've been working seasonally in Yosemite as a climbing guide, but in the off season, when I wasn't here, I was always traveling and always traveling for climbing. So, I'd go to China. I went to China a couple times I was guiding there and climbing there, all over South America, Colombia. And of course, every year coming back to the US, getting on, the US circuit, like climbing in Indian Creek and back to the valley. As I climbed, my goals started to get, I had harder and harder climbing goals. My goals started getting a little bit harder, a little bit bigger. And I started being able to tick off some of the harder classic test pieces around Yosemite Valley. And eventually I started making trips down to Patagonia and South America, other places in the far south of South America. And always coming back to the valley and kind of getting a little bit higher, like more things ticked off of my climbing list and tackling more of my climbing goals. And eventually I was able to tackle one of my bigger climbing goals, which was to climb El Capitan by myself in under 24 hours. So yeah, the more I got into climbing and the better I got at climbing, really the further I got from any kind of Palestinian identity that I even had left. And to me, that made sense because it didn't seem like there'd be any circumstances in which these two worlds would ever really collide. So it didn't really make sense to even bring it up at this point. But eventually I came across an article, actually my mom's friend sent it to me, about Palestine's rock climbing community, and about these two guys, Tim Bruins and Will Harris, who moved to Palestine to start a climbing company called Wadi Climbing and a climbing community in the area. And when I read about this, I was just really emotionally, touched by this. Like, why why would these two somewhat random like bros from Colorado move to Ramallah, Palestine of all places, to develop rock climbing and start a climbing community and eventually a climbing gym. It seems to me like a lot of the times climbing is popular in more affluent areas. And in Palestine, because of the ongoing military occupation that's happening there, a lot of people living there have a lot of restrictions in their lives and don't get a lot of the freedoms that we get here in the US, like their freedom of movement is severely limited. Their economy is depressed. They have a huge, high unemployment rate. And not the kind of areas that you would normally expect climbing to kind of take off in. So I started emailing these guys, Tim and well, mostly just Tim because Will was in the process of transitioning out of the company. So I started emailing Tim and I just wanted to know more. Like I wanted to know their story, why they ended up in Palestine and, what the climbing community was like there. So yeah, Tim told me all about, his story. He moved to Palestine in 2014. And they moved to Ramallah, which is the same town that my mother's family is from. And they started developing climbing areas all around the city. And they started taking beginners out climbing. It actually got pretty popular. So after the first year of them being there, they had taken out over 1,000, they had introduced over 1,000 beginner climbers into the sport. So yeah, it got super popular, and it wasn't just the Palestinian climbers. There's a lot of foreigners living in Ramallah doing either aid work or political activism or working as like journalists, these kind of jobs. And they were getting after it too. So it was a great way for Palestinians and foreigners to all kind of get out and focus on, the positive aspects of living in Palestine. And yeah, so in 2016, they succeeded in building Palestine. So Tim and Will succeeded in building Palestine's first climbing gym in Ramallah. And again, it got really popular. It kind of took off. A lot of people were really into it. And again, it was a great way to kind of get not only Palestinians into the sport and get their minds off of, some of the difficulties of living under a military occupation, but it's also a great way to get the foreigners living in Ramallah out and have everybody kind of come together and, have this like community that was more about like getting out and having fun than like political activism or anything like that. So yeah, I was talking to Tim and, I was asking him all these questions like what could I do to support the Palestinian climbing community? And he told me pretty much the best thing that I could do was make a trip to the area. So in 2017, me and my friend and coworker, Lauren Levinovich, traveled to Palestine. We flew into Amman, Jordan, and then we crossed from Amman over to Jerusalem and from Jerusalem into Ramallah. And yeah, I don't know why it had taken me so many years to get there. My family members always asked me, like, Miranda, you travel all over the world. Why not go to Palestine? And I kind of felt silly, but my answer, at the time was because there wasn't climbing in Palestine. And so finally I had this reason of climbing to travel somewhere, because everywhere else I had traveled to in my life, I had always traveled to go rock climbing. And I hate to admit it, but I'm not like the best tourist. I know a lot of people when they're on these trips, they want to go see the sites and go to the museums and do all the cultural stuff. And I can do about a day of that. And then I get a little bit worn out and want to just go outside and go on an adventure. And so, the idea of traveling somewhere without climbing as like a purpose and without that safety net of the climbing community seemed a little intimidating. So, seeing that there was a climbing community in Palestine really just gave me the perfect reason to end up going there in 2017. So yeah, like I said, after planes and buses, we ended up in Ramallah. And this is not the best picture to describe the day that we showed up in Ramallah, because we showed up on a kind of a Friday night and the streets were just like full of people. There's people everywhere. The mosques were blaring the call to prayer like super loudly on these speakers. And I was surprised to find out that Ramallah was not like the small village that I had imagined as a child. I mean, it might have been back then when, my family members were describing it to me, but at this point, it was more like this booming metropolis, like kind of a big city, especially for me who lives in the Eastern Sierra, even a normal sized city kind of seems like a really big city. So, yeah, it was a little bit of a culture shock to show up there in the middle of the Middle East in this kind of big city. And it was a little bit different than what I was expecting. So naturally, of course, the first thing I do is go to the climbing gym. So I roll into Wadi Climbing Gym, Lauren and I, and there's a bunch of people climbing in there. It's like I said, it's Friday night. People are just getting off of work for the weekend. And people kind of stopped and came and like introduced themselves to us. This is really cool. Like never had I been to a gym before where so many people were so eager to welcome the new people and introduce themselves to us. And of course, they had all sorts of questions. I think Tim had previously mentioned that we were going to be there. And so they were like, oh, you're the Yosemite climbers. Like, have you climbed El Capitan? Of course, they have all these questions about climbing in Yosemite. And eventually they start asking me like, wow, you like came from Yosemite to Palestine to go rock climbing? Like, and then at that point I said, yeah, and my mom is from Ramallah. And they were just so delighted to hear that, like the fact that I was, a climbing guide in Yosemite who had come to Palestine to go climbing. Sorry guys, is the audio getting messed up or is it okay?
We're good.
Okay, I wonder if I can move that. Oh yeah, that's better. Sorry about that. So yeah, they were super welcoming. It was really cool to kind of show up to a climbing gym in the middle of nowhere, somewhere I've never been before, and just have people just sort of like, be so outgoing and inclusive. So yeah, and so on the wall, I noticed that there was a map of the West Bank. And on the map, there was the 5 climbing areas around Ramallah kind of listed. And 3 of these 5 climbing areas were developed by Tim and Will and a handful of other, mostly foreigners, right around Ramallah. And then these 2 other areas, Wadi Mikmas and Ain Fada, were developed by Israeli climbers, I think back in the 90s. And so I was looking at this big map and I asked Tim, why they only chose climbing areas that were within a stone's throw of Ramallah. Why not explore some of the other, vast terrain that's out there? And Tim explained, none of the questions that I had in Palestine were simple. It's always a complicated answer, but Tim explained to me that, actually a lot of the West Bank was controlled by Israel. So over 60%, I think, at this point is controlled by Israel. And so Palestinians living and traveling in that part of the West Bank are subject to restrictions of freedom to movement and things like random arrests and house demolitions if they're living there. So when Tim and Will first started developing climbing areas, they wanted to make sure they were in areas where Palestinians could access easily and felt really comfortable to go to. So that's why he chose climbing areas that were only in Palestinian controlled areas of the West Bank. And I thought that was pretty cool for him to think about, instead of just thinking about the biggest, baddest, cliffs that he could develop with like the steepest climbs. He was thinking more along the lines of like, what are the locals going to be able to access? And that's, not something we have to think about as much in the US, I think. So yeah, the next day we made plans to go climbing, or we got to go climbing with some Ramallah locals, Tawfiq and Mujahid, who are the guys in this picture, and also Marcus, who isn't in the picture. Tawfiq is a Bedouin guy who's from a village right next to one of the climbing areas that Tim and Will developed. And Mujahid is from a village just outside of Ramallah. And Marcus, the guy who's not in the picture, he's a German aid worker who had been living in Ramallah for a few years at that point. So we all piled into Marcus's car, and he starts driving like a madman through the streets of Ramallah. And not long after we leave the city, he slams on the brake, and we're in kind of like bumper to bumper traffic. Let's see. Sorry. And I knew exactly what this was. It's something I had heard about, my entire life, and I heard about my family members' trips to the West Bank. They would always talk about checkpoints, and checkpoints are kind of like Israeli security points scattered throughout the West Bank. And Marcus explained to me, these checkpoints can throw a kink into your climbing plans. You have to kind of plan around them in kind of weird ways because they're not super consistent. Like some days, you have these checkpoints and they're searching everybody and asking for everybody's ID. And it takes hours and hours to get through one checkpoint. And another days, the same checkpoint, they might just be waving people through. And on other days, the checkpoint might be closed altogether and you'll have to find an alternate route. And in some days, there's no one attending the checkpoint at all, and you can just drive through no problem. And so that was kind of confusing. It makes it kind of hard to plan like your climbing day when you have to deal with these like checkpoints because, they could be any variety of these inconveniences, like no inconvenience to like almost thwarting your whole day. So that was something, I had heard about all through my childhood, but this is my first time seeing it in real life. And then the next thing I noticed on our little trip to the climbing area, we were going to Ain Farah that day, which is just a maybe half-hour drive from Ramallah. The other thing I noticed was the wall. And depending on who you are, you might call this wall like different things. Like, for example, you might call, if you're living in Israel, you might call this wall a security barrier because it does help prevent or help keep potential Palestinian terrorists from entering into Israel. But at the same time, some people might call it a separation barrier because the entire wall was built within the West Bank. And so you have Palestinians living on either side of that wall because they were living there before and after the wall was built. And so it separates a lot of Palestinians from each other, from their communities, from their families. It separates farmers from their crops, workers from their jobs, and so on. So it's kind of a terribly inconvenient thing for a lot of Palestinians living in the West Bank simply because the whole entire wall was built within the West Bank. So yeah, we continue on, and then we arrive at the gates of an Israeli settlement called the Almon settlement. And this particular settlements are they're pretty much like housing developments built throughout the West Bank that are for Israeli civilians. You're not allowed to live there if you're Palestinian. And this particular settlement, the Almon settlement, it kind of guards the gates to the nature preserve where we were planning on climbing that day. So most people, if you're Israeli or if you're a foreigner, you just drive through the settlement down to the base of this giant canyon, and you can park about 5 minutes from the actual climbing area. But because we were with Tawfiq and Mujahid, who were Palestinians, we weren't allowed to drive into the settlement. So we just parked on the outside and walked around the settlement. And they assured me, that this was totally safe. We weren't going to get shot or anything, that they did it all the time. So we started walking around the settlement. And although the walk was really long, it was like 45 minutes long, it was beautiful. It's one of those hikes where you almost can't even see. You know how if you're hiking in the Owens Valley and you can't quite see the gorge when you're level with the gorge because it just looks flat. But then all of a sudden the whole like bottom opens up and just drops down, and you have this huge like fissure in the earth. And so we got to hike on this amazing trail to get down to this canyon, and it's super beautiful. And the whole time, Mujahid, who I had just met, would not stop talking. He was just talking my ear off the entire time. But it was super interesting because Mujahid and I are from two completely different worlds. You know, he comes from a devout Muslim family, and his dad has 2 wives and 11 kids. And so he's part of a huge family. And, you know, he was taught to pray like 5 times a day. Um, and he was kind of, you know, grew up in this super religious family. But Mujahid, like he told me all about his life growing up and all about like his favorite story, I think, because I heard him tell this story over and over again to all sorts of different people. Was about how he went to Jordan to live in Amman, or he went to visit Amman for 1 week, and he stayed for 2 years. And while he was there, he started climbing at the climbing gym in Amman, and he taught capoeira to Syrian refugees, and he even traveled with Syrian refugees to Turkey. And I could tell that this trip for him was what kind of opened up his mind and his eyes to like adventure and the outdoors. And he told me all about how he was like such an open book. He told me all about how he's like struggling now balancing his faith and his family with his newfound love for adventure and traveling. And yeah, it's really cool, but it was hard to relate, you know. So yeah, we get to the base of the crag, and it's actually pretty crowded. There's a lot of mostly Israeli climbers climbing there. Um, and, you know, of course, I think before coming on the trip, I had this idea in my head that, you know, that climbing could save. I knew there were a lot of Israeli climbers, and I just found out about this Palestinian climbing community. And I thought, oh, you know, maybe climbing is the way that like we could save, you know, make peace in the Middle East, you know. And so we got there, I was like, oh my God, it's gonna happen. This is gonna be it. But of course it wasn't like that. It was very anticlimactic. It felt a little bit awkward, to be honest, because Mujahid, who was like talking my ear off the entire time on the hike down, all of a sudden just kind of went quiet. He got really shy. And then Tawfiq, the Bedouin guy, he didn't really speak English. And then Marcus, the German guy, he just wanted to go there to climb. So he was just like, you know, flaking the rope, like not socializing, you know. And so Lauren and I were left to kind of break the ice, which wasn't so bad because the Israeli climbers were super friendly. And they offered us, you know, cookies and coffee. And they were super interested in Yosemite and, you know, what we had climbed there, of course. So it was pretty easy to break the ice. But we still had a couple of like awkward moments. Like, for example, they asked how I liked the climbing in Israel, and I didn't know better. You know, because I had gone straight from Amman, Jordan, to Jerusalem to Ramallah just the day before. So I responded that, you know, I had never been to Israel, so I didn't know what the climbing was like there, and that was like a little bit awkward. That wasn't the response they were expecting. And that really confused me for a minute, until eventually I got my hands on the Israeli climbing guidebook, because at that point there was no Palestinian climbing guidebook. I was actually looking for one of the climbs in the area, but I kind of looked at the overview and realized, you know, according to this map that's in the kind of overview, there's no real mention of the West Bank or Palestine. It's just a slightly darker shade of yellow. So I could see how the Israeli climbers have no idea. Well, you know, I could have seen, I was a little confused about how they didn't manage to go through any of the checkpoints or notice how the roads kind of got crummy coming into the West Bank, because I'm sure the roads in Israel are much nicer. But later I was asking Marcus about all this, and he explained to me that the roads in the West Bank are segregated. So they have these roads that are pretty much mostly just for Israelis only, that very few Palestinians are allowed to drive on, that go straight from the Israeli settlements that are scattered throughout the West Bank to the mainland of Israel. So people can take these roads and they avoid all, like pretty much all the checkpoints, so they don't have to wait in traffic at the checkpoints. And I imagine they are not as ridden with potholes. So that was really eye-opening. And I realized, as an American, as a white American living in the States, I could probably relate to the Israeli climbers even more than I can relate to the Palestinian climbers, because while, the Israelis are kind of living in this one reality, there's people kind of also at the crag who are living in somewhat different reality. And a lot of the Israeli climbers didn't really, weren't super aware of what was going on. And it probably is just like me a lot of times when I'm at different crags, not aware of the, injustices happening right in my backyard. So I realized that, we can all relate in some way. But anyways, we didn't really let it, anything slow us down, any awkward interactions slow us down. Tawfiq was getting after it, trying his little project here. And I got to take a bunch of pictures and try a bunch of really cool routes on steep limestone. That's also Tawfiq climbing. And so the next day we traveled on, I checked out a different climbing area in the Palestinian controlled part of the West Bank. And this climbing area is called Jabrud. And it's a really cool area. It's just outside of Ramallah. And it's just surrounded by these like ancient olive groves. I would guess that some of these olive trees have got to be like almost 1,000 years old. You can kind of see them behind my head there. They had these trunks that were about, a few feet in diameter and super kind of grizzled and gnarly looking, with ancient terraces. It was just a really cool spot. And I got to meet more of the Palestinian climbing community. Everyone was super awesome. This is my friend Ishaq, and he was like just super stoked. He actually took a ground fall on this climb like 10 minutes before this picture was taken. He just got right back up. He was fine. He got right back up and got back on the climb and sent it. And yeah, like I said earlier, climbing in Palestine, it wasn't just for the Palestinians. There was a lot of foreigners who were getting after it as well. And since a lot of foreigners living in Ramallah are there to do some sort of aid work or some sort of political activism or human rights stuff, a lot of times their work is kind of focusing on the negative aspects of what's happening in Palestine, and kind of relating to Palestinians about all the terrible things that are happening. But with climbing, I got the feeling that, it was like a cool way for foreigners and Palestinians to interact that wasn't just focusing on the negative. Like they were focusing on getting out and sending their projects and having a good time. And I feel like it really helped enrich the climbing community there. And so, of course, any given climbing day, the Palestinian hospitality did not end at the crag. Everyone was always inviting me out to have like beers or have sweets or dinner after climbing. And I couldn't say no to the sweets. The sweets in Palestine are some of the best you'll ever have. And yeah, I also got the awesome opportunity to meet up with some old family friends, I guess. So my aunt insisted that I visited her father. So this is Hannah, who is my aunt's father, is not directly related to me, but this is where my grandparents would stay when they'd come on their visits to the Middle East. They would stay with Hannah and his daughter, my aunt's sister, Gada. And they were both living in this house. And Hannah was really interesting. He was really old. So he had like all these stories. He had been living in the same house in Ramallah since 1925 when he was born. He'd been there the whole time. And he had a lot of interesting stories about kind of the Nakba, which is what a lot of Palestinians refer to, or how Palestinians refer to the creation of the state of Israel. Because although, the state of Israel offered a lot of refugees from Europe relief and a place to be safe. It also created a lot of Palestinian refugees, over 700,000. And a lot of those Palestinian refugees are still living in these refugee camps scattered throughout the Middle East. And they're still living there, and they're still kind of waiting. They are waiting for their right to return to their homes. And like a lot of them still have their keys to their original houses that are in Israel now. But, now a lot of those houses have either been destroyed or they have Israelis living in them. So the sad part is a lot of them don't have anywhere to go back to, and they're stuck in limbo for who knows how long. So yeah, I mean, throughout my trip, I was kind of speckling my climbing days with other days, seeing the sites and trying to learn as much about what's going on there. And so I'd have these days where I'd see super sad things, and then days where I would go climbing and it would just be incredibly beautiful. And I started realizing, especially when I went climbing with other foreigners, that we could sidestep all of the complications and inconveniences of the Israeli military occupation just because we were foreigners and we had US passports. So, for example, climbing in Ain Fada, the place that we went to on the first day, I went to with Tim one day, and we were able to just drive on the Israeli only roads to get and bypass any of the checkpoints to get to the climbing area. We drove right through the settlement down to the base of the canyon. It was literally about 25 minutes from leaving Ramallah to being at the base of the climb. So it was a totally different world traveling with other foreigners than it was traveling with my new Palestinian friends. Oh. But, I could tell that none of my new Palestinian friends wanted me to feel bad at all. Like, they didn't want me to feel any kind of guilt. And, if I ever brought anything like that up, they would try to change the subject or say, oh, it's not that bad, It's almost like they were trying to shield me from my own guilt that I had of, pretty much as a foreigner, I had more rights to freedom of movement in their land than they did. I just didn't quite feel right. But yeah, anyways, they just wanted me to have a good time and go rock climbing. So that's what I would end up doing. And I just felt like so amazingly privileged and so lucky to be able to travel somewhere, to travel to Palestine, to go climbing and be able to like meet this amazing crew of like this amazing climbing community and have them, explain the, what's going on with their lives and the occupation that they have to live under. But trying so hard to not make me feel bad about any of it, and they would also, tell me all about the different canyons and the history of the land and about all of the herbs and different types of plants that grew around there. And show me the baby goats that the Bedouins had. It was just such an amazing experience. And it felt cool also to kind of be able to relate to people, like just like I had traveled all around the world before and found climbing as a way to relate to other people. It was so cool to be able to go to Palestine and again find climbing as a way to relate to people, because apparently that's the only way I know how to relate to people at this point. And yeah, so I just feel really lucky. And the climbing community there is amazing. They made me feel so welcome. They made me feel like I was really one of them. They would brag about me like they were proud of me for my accomplishments as if I was one of them, like saying like, this is Miranda, she's climbed El Cap and her mom's from Palestine. Like it just made me feel like I was, in the right place and kind of solidified my reasonings for like coming there, for going there. But yeah, so like I said, it was an amazing trip, and I owe it all to the climbing community in Palestine and Wadi climbing, and the guys who kind of started the climbing community there. So yeah, that's my trip to Palestine in 2017. And I just wanted to add a couple of updates because that was over 3 years. That was like almost 4 years ago now. And since then, there's been a few things that have happened. First of all, Tim wrote a climbing guidebook for Palestine, and it's a really cool book. It's all about how to navigate the situation there, and what desserts to order, and the best climbs to do, and how to get to the climbing areas. And remember how, one of the first few slides I showed a map of the climbing areas in Ramallah. It was, I think, just 5, and now I think there's 9 climbing areas around the West Bank. And so yeah, and I just wanted to give a thanks to this organization, Visualizing Palestine, because I got a few of my slides from them. And if you want other visuals on the area to kind of help understand what's going on there, this is the website you can find them at. And I wanted to give a big thanks for Mountain Hardware for supporting me on my second trip to Palestine in 2019. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm
Yeah.
going to open it up to our audience. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and
I
unmute.
can maybe stop the screen sharing now. I think so.
Yeah. Or put the questions in the chat, whatever works best for you.
I see the chat.
Any questions?
Yeah, I'll go. First of all, yeah, that was super dope. Thanks for like sharing the whole slideshow, everything. I think I've come across like your stuff just on like Instagram and whatnot, so it's really cool to hear about it firsthand. I guess my question is like, to what extent was like the sort of political, sort of, reality, whatever on the ground, like apparent? Like, was it just primarily like a background thing, or was it like ever super in your face, like in addition to just having to go through checkpoints and things like that?
Yeah,
Like
I
how much?
mean,
Yeah.
I wasn't there. I was there during a really calm time, and I would say it's pretty safe to go there most of the time. But yeah, like how you see the occupation and everything is kind of the day-to-day stuff, like the checkpoints, and yeah, it's mostly like the checkpoints and the traveling and going from A to B, or like if you want to go to Jerusalem with so and so, like a Palestinian person, they have to get a special permit, and so you have to decide, oh, do I want to like try to include this person, or it's just like a lot of logistical inconveniences. Yeah, I wouldn't say, and especially as a foreigner, you can go there and kind of sidestep a lot of that stuff. So does that answer your question very well?
Yeah, or even more just like about like how, I guess, like educational, like a climbing trip to the West Bank would be in terms of like experiencing and just learning about like the conflict in general too? Or is that better done through other means?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be amazing. I think you could easily, are you talking about doing a trip from the US, like an educational trip,
Or like, yeah, tacking on like I have a bunch of like Palestinian friends, just like background about myself. So I'm like from SoCal, and there's like a pretty big like Palestinian community and just Arab community in general out here. And like, so you end up going to school with like a lot of, kids who are like super closely connected to like back home family and things like that. And I've like just tried to convince maybe a handful to go climb, or like rock climb locally, check out gyms and stuff. But I think like it might be cool to like get people to go as like because they visit relatives and stuff like quite regularly, it seems like.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you would experience some of the inconveniences of the occupation. But it would, like, for me, it was a huge learning experience. If I had traveled just with foreigners, I wouldn't have learned about any of it. So I think it's good to go with locals or with people who are friends, or, you know, have family or friends there, um, because you do get to see, like, compare and contrast, you know, like their lives with what's going on in the US, I guess. Yeah.
For sure.
But that sounds like a cool trip. I would love to hear more about it. If you do organize something like that, let me know if I can, like, help in any way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll definitely get your email and stuff. Much
Yeah.
appreciated.
Yeah, it looks like Jeff wants to know what future trips do you have planned to return?
Yeah, I would love to return. Sorry, I just saw the chat stuff here. Um, yeah. Yeah, so I really want to return someday. At this point, my travel plans kind of just keep getting pushed back and back and back. So I don't have any, like, travel plans right now because of the virus, but I look forward to being able to travel again. That's for sure. Yeah.
David asks, is there any trad climbing in Palestine? Did you get a chance to travel to some of the desert sandstone spots in Jordan?
Yeah, I don't know about much trad climbing in Palestine, but if you are on that kind of adventure, like what I did was I went there. I spent a month in Palestine and then a month in Wadi Rum, and I highly recommend. They're not far from. They're about a 4-hour drive from each other, so it's a really cool trip to, like, combine climbing. I actually combined. I was climbing in Lebanon and then Palestine and then Wadi Rum, Jordan, and it was like a spectacular trip. You could spend a month in any of those areas and not run out of things to climb or things to do. So, and Wadi Rum is really cool, really special place. I could do a whole slideshow just on Wadi Rum. So, yeah.
Any more questions? No? Okay, well, awesome. Thank you so much, Miranda, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having
Oh,
me.
wait, one more question.
I was just gonna say, like, best routes, things like that, like highlights climbing wise.
In Palestine?
Yeah.
Or just in general? Oh, I would say Ain Fada is one of the best climbing areas. Wadi McMoss too. I can't remember. I'm really terrible with sport routes and remembering the climbing names, any of the sport routes. So I'm just like, oh, there's a really cool, like, 12A at this one cave. I I should have grabbed my guidebook before sitting down to this presentation. But yeah, Wadi, like, Infada, McMass, yeah, just like there's really cool canyons there, and they're just really beautiful, like steep limestone walls.
One more question. It looks like, what is your favorite climbing in in Yosemite?
Yosemite, gosh, that's a hard one. It's like, what's your favorite song or something? I guess maybe the rostrum is my favorite climbing in Yosemite. It's a steep 511 rock climb. It's about 8 pitches long. It's really good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Miranda.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for everyone for joining today. It's really cool to see you all.
Thank you all for joining us. And we'll have our next one next Thursday. So we'll be back here at the same time.
Cool.
Awesome. Okay.
Bye, guys. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.